They said it was just an old, useless horse. But when the hyenas approached, it did something that would reveal a secret kept for years. The morning frost clung to the patched aluminum siding of Amber Sullivan's trailer, a thin silver coating that would melt away with the first rays of the Kentucky sun. Inside, beneath a patchwork quilt worn thin by years of use, she stirred awake, her breath visible in the cold air. The ancient space heater had given up sometime in the night again. Amber sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and reached instinctively for the photo frame on her bedside milk crate. Through the cracked glass, her parents smiled back at her, her father's Cherokee features sharp and proud beside her mother's softer Irish complexion. 10 years gone now, taken in an instant on a rain-slicked highway when Amber was just 12. The photograph was fading slowly, like her memories of them. "Morning, Mom." "Morning, Dad," she whispered, a ritual unchanged since the first night in foster care. Her fingers found the worn neck of the old acoustic guitar propped against the wall, the only other inheritance besides the photograph. She strummed a few quiet chords, letting the gentle vibrations travel up her arms and settle her mind for the day ahead. The song came unbidden, a Cherokee lullaby her father had taught her about horses running free beneath star-filled skies. Amber closed her eyes, remembering her father's deep voice as he tucked her into bed. "The horses listen to the heart, not the hands," he would say, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Our people have always known this. When the white men came with their whips and spurs, they tried to break the horses' spirits, but the horses remembered us, the ones who spoke to them as brothers." The memory warmed her more effectively than the broken heater ever could. With a deep breath, she set the guitar aside and rose to face the day. Today was important. Her interview at Bluegrass Stables, the kind of place that normally wouldn't glance twice at someone from Whistle Stop Trailer Park. 40 minutes later, Amber stood at the imposing wrought iron gates of one of Lexington's most prestigious horse breeding operations. Owned by Texas oil magnate Richard Montgomery, Bluegrass Stables was known for producing Kentucky Derby contenders with bloodlines worth millions, the kind of place where people like her cleaned stalls, not gave orders. Jim Wilkins, the stable manager, looked up from his clipboard, eyes narrowing slightly at her worn jeans and second-hand boots. His gaze lingered on the faded Cherokee Dreamcatcher pendant at her throat. "Sullivan?" he asked, consulting his notes. "Says here you've worked with horses before?" "Yes, sir. 3 years at Riverside Stables until they closed down. Before that, helping out at Henderson's farm since I was 14. She didn't mention that most of that work had been off the books, paid in cash at rates well below minimum wage. "We're looking for someone to clean stalls, change bedding, basic maintenance. Nothing complicated." His tone suggested she shouldn't expect anything more. "Pays $9 an hour, 5 days a week. No benefits until after 6 months if you last that long." Amber nodded, trying not to show how desperately she needed this job. Her last paycheck from the diner had barely covered this month's lot rent. "I can start today if you need," she offered. Wilkins shrugged. "Tomorrow 6 a.m. Don't be late." He handed her a stack of forms. "Fill these out before you leave. And that pendant," he pointed to her necklace, "keep it under your shirt. Mr. Montgomery prefers a certain professional appearance." Amber's fingers instinctively touched the Dreamcatcher, a gift from her father on her 10th birthday. She nodded silently, already swallowing the first of many indignities this job would likely bring. The next morning dawned gray and misty as Amber made her way through the elaborate stable complex. Gleaming white fences enclosed emerald pastures where million-dollar thoroughbreds grazed like living sculptures. The contrast with her rusty trailer wasn't lost on her. Marco, a veteran stable hand with graying temples, showed her around. Mucking tools here, feed storage there. Morning shift starts with cleaning, then fresh bedding. Afternoon is second cleaning and helping with feed. He gestured toward a distant section of the property where well-dressed trainers worked with horses in a practice ring. "Don't bother them. They don't like being interrupted by," he caught himself, "by maintenance staff." As they rounded a corner, Amber noticed a separate stable set apart from the others. Unlike the pristine white buildings that housed most of the horses, this one was darker, with additional security features, reinforced doors, and what looked like camera equipment. "What's over there?" she asked. Marco's expression tightened. "Stable 13. Stay away from there. That's where they keep Phantom." "Phantom?" Marco lowered his voice. "El Diablo Negro, we call him. $4 million thoroughbred, Montgomery's prize investment, supposed to be his Derby winner. Now, he made the sign of the cross. A killer. Broke free during training last year, trampled his trainer to death. They should have put him down, but Montgomery refuses. Too much money invested." As if sensing their attention, a chorus of agitated neighs erupted from the isolated stable. "Remember what I said," Marco warned. "Stay away from Stable 13. Montgomery keeps him alive out of pride, but everyone knows that horse is cursed." Throughout her first week, Amber worked harder than she ever had, muscles screaming as she hauled heavy bags of feed and pushed wheelbarrows filled with soiled bedding. The elite trainers passed by without acknowledgement, their Italian leather boots carefully avoiding the same ground she walked on. "Look at little Pocahontas playing with horse shit," sneered Davis, one of the senior trainers, to his colleagues as they watched Amber clearing a stall. Their laughter cut through the air, sharp as a whip. Yet despite the exhaustion and humiliation, Amber found herself drawn repeatedly to Stable 13. On breaks, she would walk within viewing distance, watching as handlers approached the isolated structure with visible trepidation. Twice, she witnessed Phantom during his rare supervised exercise sessions, a magnificent black stallion nearly 17 hands high, powerful muscles rippling beneath a coat that gleamed like polished onyx even under the overcast sky. But what struck her most were his eyes, not wild as everyone claimed, but filled with a pain she recognized all too well. 7 days into her employment, Amber was finishing her evening shift when emergency sirens began to wail across the property. Outside, the sky had turned an ominous greenish black. "Tornado warning!" shouted Wilkins, running between buildings. "Everyone to the storm shelter now! Get the priority horses secured first!" Chaos erupted as handlers rushed to evacuate the most valuable thoroughbreds to the reinforced underground shelter. Amber joined the frantic effort, helping guide nervous horses through the increasingly violent wind. 20 minutes into the evacuation, as rain began to lash down in horizontal sheets, a horrible realization struck her. No one had mentioned Phantom. In the panic, Stable 13 had been forgotten. "What about Phantom?" she shouted to Wilkins over the howling wind. "Too dangerous," he yelled back. "We'll check on him after the storm passes." Lightning cracked overhead, followed immediately by a deafening thunderclap. From the direction of Stable 13 came a sound that chilled Amber's blood, a desperate, terrified scream that was unmistakably equine, yet almost human in its fear. Without thinking, Amber broke away from the group and ran toward the isolated stable, rain instantly soaking her to the skin. Behind her, she heard Wilkins shouting for her to come back, his voice quickly swallowed by the storm. Reaching Stable 13, she found the security door vibrating with the force of impacts from within. Through the small observation window, she could see Phantom in full panic, rearing and slamming himself against the walls of his enclosure, blood already visible on his shoulder, where he'd injured himself. The keypad lock required a code she didn't have. Amber looked around desperately until she spotted an emergency override key in a small glass case labeled "Fire Emergency Only." Without hesitation, she broke the glass with her elbow and grabbed the key. As the door swung open, time seemed to slow. Phantom stood at the far end of his stall, sides heaving, nostrils flared, his magnificent form outlined by lightning flashing through the skylight. When he saw Amber, he reared to his full height, front hooves pawing the air menacingly. Instead of retreating, Amber stood her ground. Something deeper than thought told her that running would be fatal. She began to sing softly, the same Cherokee lullaby she'd played on her guitar that morning, the song about free horses under open skies. From the doorway behind her, she dimly heard voices. Marco and another handler had followed her, watching in horror. "My God, he'll kill her," one of them whispered, already reaching for his phone. But Phantom had frozen, his ears swiveling forward at the unfamiliar sound. Amber continued singing, her voice growing steadier as she took one small step forward, then another, The massive horse lowered his front legs to the ground, but remained tense, ready to strike. Now close enough to see clearly, Amber noticed what she hadn't been able to observe from a distance. Scars. Old welts and marks across his flanks and chest, some still healing, evidence of methods far more brutal than the standard training practices used with valuable thoroughbreds. "It's okay," she whispered between verses of the song. "I'm not going to hurt you." Another crash of thunder shook the building. Phantom flinched, but remarkably didn't rear again. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Amber as rain began to pour through leaks in the roof, soaking them both. Slowly, Amber sat down on the straw-covered floor, continuing her soft singing. To the astonishment of the men watching from the doorway, Phantom took a hesitant step toward her, then another. When he was close enough that she could feel his warm breath, he lowered his massive head, nostrils flaring as he caught her scent. Minutes passed in this delicate standoff as the storm raged outside. Then, in a movement so gradual it was almost imperceptible, Phantom lowered himself to the ground beside Amber, his breathing finally slowing. With infinite gentleness, she reached out and touched his neck, feeling him tremble beneath her fingers. By the time Wilkins arrived with security personnel and tranquilizer guns, he was met with an impossible scene. Amber Sullivan, the trailer park girl hired to clean stalls, sitting cross-legged on the floor of Stable 13, the head of the most dangerous horse in Kentucky resting peacefully in her lap. Both were soaked from the rain pouring through the ceiling, but in stark contrast to the violent storm outside, the space between them held a stillness that seemed almost sacred. "You understand, don't you?" Amber whispered to Phantom, her fingers tracing the raised scars along his neck. "You know pain too." Dawn broke over Bluegrass Stables in a wash of pale gold, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the morning mist that clung to the Kentucky hills. It was barely 4 in the morning when Amber Sullivan made her way across the dew-dampened grass, her breath visible in the chilly air. 3 days had passed since the storm. 3 days since the moment she'd sat on the straw-covered floor with Phantom's massive head in her lap, feeling the slow rhythm of his breathing against her legs. The memory of that connection pulled her forward now, even as common sense whispered that she should stay away. Montgomery's prize stallion was worth more than she would earn in several lifetimes. If caught, she'd lose the job she desperately needed. But something stronger than fear propelled her through the quiet stables. The night guard, an elderly man named Pete, dozed in his chair near the entrance, a half-empty thermos of coffee tilting precariously in his slack grip. Amber moved silently past him, her footsteps muffled by years of practice moving through foster homes where making noise meant inviting trouble. Stable 13 loomed ahead, its reinforced door a barrier between worlds. Since the storm, they'd installed a new keypad lock, but Marco had inadvertently revealed the code when entering it yesterday, 2479. With trembling fingers, Amber punched in the numbers, her heart hammering against her ribs as the lock disengaged with a soft click. Inside, the stable was dark except for a sliver of moonlight filtering through the small window. Phantom's massive form shifted in the shadows, a movement accompanied by the sound of heavy hooves against straw. Amber remained motionless in the doorway, giving her eyes time to adjust and, more importantly, giving Phantom time to recognize her scent. "It's just me," she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the stillness. Slowly, she lowered herself to the ground just inside the entrance, her back against the wall, creating distance that said, "I'm not a threat." From her backpack, she withdrew the old guitar, its wood worn smooth by years of handling. Without rushing, she began to tune it, the quiet plinks of each string adjustment filling the space between them. Phantom remained at the far end of the stall, his silhouette tense, ears forward. When Amber began to play, she chose not the Cherokee lullaby from before, but something simpler, just a few repeated notes, gentle and unhurried, like raindrops on a still pond. "My dad used to say that music speaks when words fail," she said conversationally, as though Phantom might understand every word. "He said the Cherokee people believed that horses could hear the songs in our hearts before we even sang them." She played for nearly 20 minutes, never moving closer, never making demands, just offering sound and presence in a world that had taught Phantom that humans meant pain and control. When she finally stopped, the silence between them felt different, expectant rather than fearful. "I should go before the morning shift arrives," she said, rising slowly. "But I'll come back tomorrow, if that's okay with you." As she turned to leave, she heard a soft nickering behind her. Not the aggressive snorting she'd witnessed from afar when trainers approached him, but something almost inquisitive. This became her ritual. Arriving before dawn, sitting just inside the door, playing her guitar and talking softly about inconsequential things, the way the mist hung over the practice track in the mornings, the family of rabbits that lived near her trailer, the stars she could see through the hole in her roof on clear nights, stories of freedom and open spaces, delivered without expectation. On the fourth morning, Phantom had moved closer to the center of the stall by the time she arrived. On the seventh, he was waiting near the door, though he retreated when she entered. Progress measured in inches, in the gradually relaxing set of his powerful shoulders, in the way his eyes followed her movements without the white rim of fear showing. During her regular shifts, Amber was careful to maintain distance from Stable 13, though she found herself inventing reasons to walk nearby, checking fences, collecting stray pieces of equipment. From these stolen glances, she could see that Phantom's behavior remained unpredictable with others. When a veterinary assistant attempted to enter with medication, the stallion had kicked the door so violently that the young man had dropped his supplies and fled. "That devil hasn't changed," Davis sneered when he caught Amber looking toward Stable 13 one afternoon. "Montgomery should cut his losses and sell him for glue. Horse killed a man. Some animals can't be fixed." Amber bit her tongue against the retort that rose in her throat. "Some wounds can't be healed with whips and spurs," she wanted to say. Instead, she ducked her head and returned to mucking stalls, the same invisible person she'd learned to be in every foster home. 2 weeks into her secret morning visits, Amber arrived to find someone already at Stable 13. Jackson Miller, the elderly veterinarian, was peering through the observation window with a puzzled expression. Her heart sank, certain she'd been discovered, but when he turned, his face registered surprise rather than accusation. "What brings you here so early, girl?" he asked, his voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes. Amber clutched her guitar case tighter. I was going to practice playing where I wouldn't disturb anyone." Jackson's eyes narrowed, taking in the guitar, then shifting to the keypad lock on Stable 13. The empty sleeve where his right arm should have been twitched slightly, a phantom limb responding to a memory of pain. "Interesting choice of practice room," he said finally, "especially given what's inside." Amber remained silent, neither confirming nor denying. After a moment, Jackson sighed. "I've been watching him this past week. He's different, calmer in the mornings, though he still raises hell when the regular handlers come around." He studied her face. "You've been coming here, haven't you?" The denial died on her lips at his expression. Not angry, but genuinely curious. Slowly, she nodded. "Show me," he said simply. With trembling hands, Amber entered the code and opened the door, expecting Phantom to retreat at the sight of a stranger. Instead, the stallion remained where he was, halfway across the stall, his attention fixed on the guitar in her hands. "Go on," Jackson encouraged softly. "Do whatever you've been doing." Amber sat in her usual spot and began to play. The familiar melody filled the space, and to her amazement, Phantom took a step forward, then another, moving closer than he ever had before. When the song ended, the horse stood just a few feet away, his breath visible in the cool morning air. "Sweet Jesus," Jackson whispered. "I've worked with horses for 50 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's like you're speaking a language only he understands." "I don't do anything special," Amber said. "I just sit with him, talk to him, play music. That's what makes it remarkable. No whips, no restraints, no dominance, just," he gestured vaguely, "connection." His eyes took on a faraway look. "When he took my arm last year, Everyone said he was acting out of aggression. But I always wondered if it was fear. Fear we caused with our methods. Over the next week, Jackson became her silent ally, occasionally covering for her extended absences during morning shifts. Sometimes he would watch from the doorway as she played for Phantom, his weathered face thoughtful as he observed the stallion's gradual transformation. Word began to spread among the stable hands. Maria Gonzalez, who managed feed inventory, caught Amber one morning returning from stable 13. "Es verdad?" she asked quietly. "They say you can touch El Diablo Negro without him trying to kill you." Amber hesitated, but something in Maria's expression, open, without judgment, made her nod. "My grandmother in Oaxaca," Maria continued, "she had this gift. Animals that others feared would eat from her hand. She said it was because she listened to what they couldn't say with words." She smiled slightly. "Perhaps you have la misma magia." At the Rusty Horseshoe, the small diner where Amber occasionally washed dishes in exchange for meals, conversations about the Cherokee Girl and the Demon Horse became frequent. Mabel Johnson, the no-nonsense owner who'd survived 60 years as a black businesswoman in Kentucky, listened to the gossip with shrewd interest. "That Montgomery fella treats horses like engines, just parts to be used up and replaced," Mabel commented one evening as Amber cleared tables. "About time someone showed him there's more than one way to work with an animal." "I'm not trying to prove anything," Amber protested weakly. "Honey, sometimes the most powerful statements are the ones we make without trying," Mabel replied, sliding an extra slice of pie toward her. "Just be careful. Men like Montgomery don't take kindly to being shown up, especially by folks they consider beneath them." 3 weeks into their secret sessions, Amber arrived to find Phantom waiting by the door. When she settled into her usual spot, guitar in hand, something extraordinary happened. The massive stallion lay down on the straw beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. With breath held, she began to play, and for the first time, she dared to reach out and touch his neck while continuing the melody. The sensation of his coat beneath her fingers, the trust implied in his vulnerable position, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. This animal, feared and isolated, condemned as a killer, had chosen to believe that her hands meant something different than the hands that had left scars across his body. "You're not what they say you are," she whispered. "Neither of us is." The moment was so profound that neither noticed the stable door opening wider, nor the sharp intake of breath from the figure standing there. "What the hell is going on here?" The voice, cold with fury, shattered the peace. Richard Montgomery stood in the doorway, his expensive suit incongruous in the simple stable setting, his face flushed with anger. Behind him, Jim Wilkins looked on with a mixture of shock and dismay. Phantom immediately tensed, rising to his feet with a speed that made Montgomery step back instinctively. But instead of charging or retreating to the far wall as he might have weeks earlier, the stallion remained beside Amber, his body positioned almost protectively between her and the newcomers. "Mr. Montgomery, I can explain," Amber began, scrambling to her feet. "Who authorized this?" Montgomery demanded, his voice rising. "A girl from the trailers playing with my $4 million investment. Are you out of your mind, Wilkins?" "Sir, I had no idea," the manager stammered. Montgomery's gaze raked over Amber, taking in her worn clothes, the Dreamcatcher pendant now visible outside her shirt, the battered guitar case on the ground. His lip curled slightly. "He's not your horse, Mr. Montgomery," Amber said, surprising herself with her steady voice. "He belongs to himself. He always has." The stable fell silent, the only sound Phantom's steady breathing beside her. Montgomery's expression shifted from shock to cold fury at her insubordination. "You're fired," he said flatly, "and I'll make damn sure you never work at any respectable stable in Kentucky again. Go back to your reservation or wherever you came from." As security escorted her from the property, Jackson caught her briefly by the exit. "This isn't over," he whispered urgently. "What you've done with that horse, people are talking. Montgomery can fire you, but he can't undo the connection you've made." After Montgomery's furious departure, Jackson pulled Amber aside and whispered urgently, He's not just irritated, he's scared. You accomplished in weeks what his elite trainers couldn't achieve in months, and men like Montgomery can't stand being outdone, especially by someone like you. He's not just irritated, he's scared. You accomplished in weeks what his elite trainers couldn't achieve in months, and men like Montgomery can't stand being outdone, especially by someone like you. Jackson's warning echoed in Amber's mind as she trudged back to her trailer that evening, guitar case banging against her leg with each weary step. The late April sun cast long shadows across the potholed road leading to Whistle Stop Trailer Park. Her termination papers, hastily prepared by Wilkins, crinkled in her back pocket, a formal declaration that her presence was no longer welcome at Bluegrass Stables. But it wasn't her lost job that made her chest ache with each breath. It was Phantom. The image of him standing beside her, tense but trusting as Montgomery stormed in, haunted her. What would happen to him now? Sleep eluded her that night. She tossed beneath her thin blanket, imagining Phantom alone in Stable 13, waiting for a morning visitor who wouldn't come. Would he understand her absence as abandonment? The thought was unbearable. Dawn found her sitting on her trailer's rickety steps, watching the sky lighten from black to purple to pale blue. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. The black one refuses food since yesterday. No water either. He looks for you. Amber closed her eyes, a wave of nausea washing over her. She'd known this would happen. The fragile trust they'd built required consistency, and now she'd vanished without explanation, like everyone else in Phantom's life who hadn't hurt him. Throughout the day, similar messages arrived from various stable hands. Jackson sent a terse update. Phantom aggressive again, kicked through partition. Montgomery furious. Later, another. Vet tried sedation. Horse wouldn't allow approach. Situation deteriorating. By evening, Amber couldn't bear it anymore. She walked to the Rusty Horseshoe, seeking distraction more than food she couldn't afford. The diner buzzed with unusual activity for a Tuesday night. When she entered, conversations briefly hushed before resuming with greater intensity. Mabel spotted her immediately, bustling over with a concerned frown. "There she is. Come sit, child. We've been talking about you." A corner booth held an unlikely gathering. Jackson, still in his veterinary coat, Maria and two other stable hands, Pete the night guard, and several local horse people Amber recognized from nearby farms. "What's going on?" she asked, sliding cautiously into the space they made for her. "Intervention," Mabel declared, placing a steaming plate of meatloaf before Amber without being asked. "Eat while we talk. You look half dead." Jackson leaned forward, his one remaining hand wrapped around a coffee mug. "Phantom's condition is worsening by the hour. He's refusing all care, all food. When trainers approach, he becomes violent, worse than before you came." "Montgomery insisted on bringing in his top trainer from Texas," Maria added. "Big man with spurs and a crop. It was..." She crossed herself. "Muy malo." Phantom nearly broke through the wall. "Why are you telling me this?" Amber asked, though she already knew. "Because Montgomery is wrong," Jackson said simply. "I've spent 50 years working with traumatized horses. What you did with Phantom wasn't luck or novelty. It was the most extraordinary display of interspecies communication I've ever witnessed." Pete nodded solemnly. "That horse understood you, plain as day. Never seen anything like it." Mabel slid into the booth beside Amber. "I've started a little collection," she said, nodding toward a jar on the counter labeled, "For when that bastard finally fires her." "Not much yet, but enough to keep you afloat while we figure something out." Tears pricked at Amber's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She'd learned long ago not to rely on others. Every foster home had taught that lesson thoroughly. Yet here were people she barely knew, organizing around a cause they had no obligation to care about. "I appreciate it," she said carefully. "But Montgomery made it clear I'm not welcome back. And he's right. It's his horse, his property." "That's where you're wrong, girl," Jackson said, his voice suddenly fierce. "A horse isn't a car or a couch. Living beings have intrinsic worth beyond ownership. What Montgomery is doing, isolating an intelligent animal, denying him proper care, planning to destroy him when he's no longer profitable. It's not just wrong, it's cruel. Later that night, lying in her bed, Amber replayed the conversation at the diner. Jackson's final comment before they dispersed had struck deepest. Montgomery said he'd rather have a dead horse than be manipulated by a trailer park girl. Those weren't idle words. He means it. The realization that Phantom might be destroyed out of pure human pride made her physically ill. She fell into a restless sleep filled with dreams of running horses and breaking fences. 3 days after her firing, Amber was washing dishes at the Rusty Horseshoe. Mabel had offered her shifts to help cover bills, when her phone chimed with a message from Maria. Fire in the East Stables, coming towards Stable 13, everyone panicking. Amber's heart stopped. Without a word to Mabel, she dropped the plate she was washing and ran, ignoring the startled calls behind her. The 3 miles between the diner and Bluegrass Stables had never seemed so vast. Her lungs burned as she pushed herself harder, the acrid smell of smoke growing stronger as she approached. In the distance, sirens wailed. When she finally reached the property, chaos reigned. Horses neighed in panic as handlers led them to safety. Smoke billowed from a building adjacent to Stable 13, flames visible through broken windows. The wind cruelly blew directly toward Phantom's isolated quarters. Security was focused on the evacuation, giving Amber the chance to slip onto the grounds unnoticed. She ran toward Stable 13, heart hammering against her ribs. Through the thickening smoke, she could make out a cluster of men struggling with something, or someone, at the stable entrance. Drawing closer, she saw 6 handlers attempting to control Phantom, who had somehow been led from his stall, but was now in full panic, rearing and striking out with lethal force. One man already lay on the ground, clutching his shoulder, while others wielded restraint poles with growing desperation. "Get the tranquilizer gun," someone shouted. "We're going to lose him." "There's no time," another voice responded. "The fire's spreading too fast." Through the chaos, Phantom's wild eyes seemed to scan the scene, looking for something, or someone, that wasn't there. His terror was palpable, a living force that made the trained handlers seem like children trying to contain a hurricane. "Phantom!" Amber called, her voice carrying across the chaotic scene. The effect was immediate and extraordinary. The massive stallion froze mid-motion, ears swiveling toward her voice. Every head turned in her direction, including that of Richard Montgomery, who had just emerged from a black SUV that had screeched to a halt nearby. "Sullivan, get off my property immediately," he shouted, but his words were lost as Phantom let out a high-pitched whinny and pulled free from his handlers, scattering them like bowling pins. For one terrible moment, Amber thought the stallion would charge her in his panic. Instead, he stopped a few yards away, sides heaving, nostrils flared, but eyes fixed on her with unmistakable recognition. "It's okay," she said softly, holding out her hand, palm up. "I'm here now." Ignoring the shouts of warning, she walked slowly toward the trembling horse. Behind Phantom, the stable roof began to crackle as embers landed on its wooden shingles. Time was running out. Without hesitation, Amber reached Phantom's side and, in one fluid motion that drew gasps from onlookers, swung herself onto his bare back. No saddle, no bridle, no equipment of any kind. Just her hands gently touching the sides of his neck, and her voice whispering Cherokee words her father had taught her about courage and trust. "Let's go," she murmured, applying the lightest pressure with her legs. To the astonishment of everyone watching, including a stone-faced Montgomery, Phantom responded immediately. With Amber balanced on his back, the stallion trotted away from the burning building, ears forward, body language transformed from panic to purpose. But what happened next left even the most skeptical handlers speechless. After reaching a safe distance, Amber guided Phantom back toward the endangered stables. 2 more horses remained trapped in a nearby building, their terrified whinnies audible over the roar of the fire. "She's insane!" Montgomery shouted. "Stop her!" No one moved as Amber directed Phantom to the stable doors. Working together with an almost telepathic coordination, they helped herd the panicked horses to safety, Phantom positioning himself like a cutting horse, anticipating and blocking escape attempts in the wrong direction. By the time firefighters arrived to tackle the blaze, The image was burned into the memory of everyone present. Amber Sullivan, the trailer park girl Montgomery had dismissed, sitting astride the supposedly unrideable Phantom, surrounded by the horses they had saved together. The stallion stood calm and alert despite the chaos, responding to her lightest touch as if they shared one nervous system. Phones captured the moment from every angle. A local news crew that had arrived to cover the fire swung their cameras toward the more compelling story, the striking tableau of the slight young woman and the powerful black horse, silhouetted against the smoke-filled sky. When it was over, when the last ember had been extinguished and the property secured, Montgomery approached Amber, who still sat on Phantom's back, unwilling to break their connection. "This changes nothing," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're still trespassing on private property. The horse is still mine." "Look around you," Amber replied quietly, nodding toward the crowd of phones recording their exchange. "This isn't just between us anymore." As Montgomery stalked away, Jackson appeared at Phantom's shoulder, looking up at Amber with a mixture of awe and concern. "That was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever witnessed," he said, "but I'm glad you came. No one else could have saved him today." Phantom shifted beneath her, and Amber stroked his neck soothingly. In the distance, she could see Montgomery huddled with his attorneys, gesturing angrily in her direction. While cell phones captured the moment of Amber mounted on Phantom leading other horses to safety, Montgomery observed with expression sombria, susurrando ao seu assistente, "Find out everything about this girl. I want every detail of her past, every weakness, every secret that can be used. Nobody humiliates me like this and gets away with it. Find out everything about this girl. I want every detail of her past, every weakness, every secret that can be used. Nobody humiliates me like this and gets away with it." Montgomery's threat lingered in the air long after his Mercedes had disappeared down the winding driveway of Bluegrass Stables. Amber slid carefully from Phantom's back, her legs trembling from adrenaline and exertion. The stallion stayed close, his muzzle gently nudging her shoulder as if ensuring she remained safe. By morning, everything had changed. Amber woke to the insistent buzzing of her phone. 17 missed calls, 32 text messages, and social media notifications numbering in the hundreds. Bleary-eyed, she tapped on the first link someone had sent and found herself staring at her own face. There she was, captured mid-motion atop Phantom, silhouetted against billowing smoke, the massive black stallion carrying her fearlessly toward danger rather than away from it. The local news headline read, "Cherokee woman tames killer horse, saves lives in Bluegrass Stables fire." "This wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered to the empty trailer, pulling her knees to her chest. Within hours, news vans lined the rutted entrance to Whistle Stop Trailer Park. Amber peered through a crack in her curtains, watching reporters position themselves for stand-ups, their crisp blazers and perfect hair incongruous against the backdrop of weather-beaten homes and rusted swing sets. "Miss Sullivan, could we have a moment of your time?" called a woman holding a microphone emblazoned with the CBS logo. "How did you communicate with a horse others couldn't control?" shouted another. Amber retreated from the window, sinking onto her sagging mattress. Her phone buzzed again. Maria this time. "Are you watching the news? They're calling you the Horse Whisperer of Kentucky. Phantom is trending on Twitter." Uncertain what to do, Amber pulled on her cleanest pair of jeans and a faded blue t-shirt and made her way to the Rusty Horseshoe. Perhaps Mabel would have advice about handling the unexpected attention. When she pushed open the diner's door, conversations abruptly hushed before erupting into applause. Regular patrons, many of whom had never spoken to her beyond placing orders, surged forward with congratulations and questions. On the television mounted above the counter, a clip played on repeat. Amber and Phantom guiding frightened horses away from the flames, moving with the synchronicity of partners who had trained together for years rather than weeks. "Look at that," an elderly rancher said, pointing to the screen. "That ain't just good horsemanship. That's something else entirely." Mabel hurried over, shooing people back to give Amber space. "You're the talk of 3 counties, girl. Come sit before you fall down." Over coffee and pancakes she hadn't ordered but Mabel insisted she needed, Amber watched the news coverage expand. A horse behavior expert from the University of Kentucky was being interviewed. "What we're seeing here is extraordinary. This horse was deemed unrideable after a traumatic incident, yet here he's not just tolerating a rider, he's actively working with her in a high-stress situation. This challenges everything we understand about rehabilitation timelines for severely traumatized horses." Amber's phone rang, an unfamiliar number with a New York area code. Hesitantly, she answered. "Miss Sullivan, this is Vanessa Winters from Equestrian Magazine. We'd like to feature you and Phantom in our next issue. Would you be available for an interview and photo shoot?" I don't think that's possible," Amber stammered. "I don't work at the stables anymore. Mr. Montgomery fired me last week." "That's part of the story we're interested in," the woman replied smoothly. "We've heard rumors about questionable training methods at bluegrass stables. This could be an opportunity to tell your side." After ending the call with a promise to consider it, Amber looked up to find Mabel watching her intently. "You need to do it," the older woman said firmly. "Use this attention to protect that horse. It's your only weapon against Montgomery." Later that afternoon, while hiding in her trailer from the persistent media, Amber received another text from Maria. "People talking about you all over the stables. Some mock the Cherokee princess and her magic horse, others impressed. Montgomery called emergency meeting, says any employee talking to press will be terminated." That evening, an anonymous interview appeared online, a former bluegrass stables groom describing harsh training methods. When horses didn't perform, they'd use shock devices, withhold water. I saw welts under saddle blankets. That black stallion Phantom, he didn't go crazy for no reason. They pushed him until he broke. Montgomery's PR team issued swift denials, but more voices joined the chorus. A female exercise rider who'd left 2 years earlier revealed she'd been paid to sign a non-disclosure agreement after witnessing systematic abuse. What that Sullivan girl did with Phantom, it's not magic or mysticism. It's what happens when you approach a horse with respect instead of dominance. 3 days after the fire, Jackson called Amber. "Phantom's refusing food again," he said without preamble. "Reacting violently when anyone approaches. Montgomery's furious but trapped. Can't be seen mistreating the horse now that the world's watching, but can't admit you have a connection he can't replicate. Can't you convince him to let me see Phantom? Just for the horse's well-being?" "He's too proud," Jackson sighed. "But something's happening you should know about. Equestrian Magazine is sending a team tomorrow for a feature on bluegrass stables' innovative rehabilitation of Phantom. Montgomery's trying to control the narrative, show that his trainers can handle the horse just fine without you." Amber's stomach knotted with worry. "Phantom won't cooperate. He'll lash out if they push him." "I know," Jackson replied gravely. "That's what I'm afraid of." The next morning, Amber paced her small trailer, checking social media obsessively for updates. Around noon, her phone rang, an agitated Wilkins on the line. "Sullivan, I need you at the stables, now." "I thought I was banned from the property." That was before Phantom destroyed $50,000 of camera equipment and nearly trampled Montgomery's top trainer in front of Equestrian Magazine's entire editorial team. Wilkins sounded simultaneously furious and desperate. "Mr. Montgomery has reconsidered his position, temporarily." 30 minutes later, Amber walked through the gates of bluegrass stables, escorted by security as if she were visiting royalty rather than the stable hand they'd dismissed days earlier. Near stable 13, a tense scene unfolded. Montgomery in an immaculate suit that couldn't hide his fury. Several shell-shocked-looking journalists clutching notepads. A man with a bandaged arm being attended to by Jackson, and various staff attempting to clean up what looked like the aftermath of a small tornado. From inside the stable came the sounds of a horse in distress, heavy impacts against wood, high-pitched whinnies that bordered on screams. Montgomery approached, his face a careful mask. "Miss Sullivan, thank you for coming on such short notice." The formality, the absence of contempt in his tone, told Amber everything she needed to know about his desperation. "What happened?" she asked simply. A small misunderstanding, Montgomery said, loud enough for the journalists to hear. Phantom is still adjusting to his new training regimen. We thought perhaps, given your previous rapport with him, you might assist in today's demonstration. Translation: his publicity stunt had backfired spectacularly, and now he needed her to save face. I'd be happy to help, Amber replied, matching his public politeness while meeting his eyes with steady determination. For Phantom's sake. As she approached Stable 13, the frantic movements inside immediately quieted. She punched in the code she still remembered and slowly opened the door. Phantom stood at the far end, sides heaving, a fresh cut visible on his flank where he'd injured himself in his panic. The moment he saw her, his posture changed, head lowering slightly, ears rotating forward, nostrils flaring to catch her scent. Hey, big guy, she said softly. I've missed you too. Conscious of the many eyes watching through the open door, Amber moved unhurriedly into the stable, speaking in the same gentle tones she'd used during their morning sessions. I know you're scared. I know they pushed you. It's okay now. Phantom's eyes never left her as she approached, her hand extended palm up in offering rather than demand. When she finally reached him, he lowered his massive head to her shoulder, exhaling a long breath that seemed to release weeks of tension. With the most natural motion in the world, as if they'd practiced it 100 times, Amber turned and led Phantom toward the stable door. The stallion followed willingly, his hooves falling in perfect rhythm with her steps. Outside, the assembled group watched in stunned silence as horse and woman emerged into the sunlight, Phantom's coat gleaming ebony despite the ordeal he'd just endured. Without prompting, the stallion positioned himself to allow Amber to mount, and with the same fluid grace she'd shown during the fire, she swung onto his back. Together they performed a simple circuit of the training ring. No saddle, no bridle, not even a lead rope. Just subtle shifts in Amber's posture and quiet words that seemed to flow directly from her thoughts to Phantom's understanding. A photographer from Equestrian magazine, recovering his professional instincts, began snapping rapid-fire shots. The moment was too perfect to miss, Amber leaning forward to embrace Phantom's neck, the horse's eyes closed in absolute trust, the sunlight catching the Dreamcatcher pendant that hung from her neck, turning it into a perfect halo behind them. Montgomery watched with a carefully neutral expression, though the muscle twitching in his jaw betrayed his true feelings. When the demonstration concluded and Amber had returned Phantom safely to his stable, the reporter from Equestrian magazine approached her. That was remarkable, she said, studying Amber with newfound respect. Would you be willing to tell me how you established this connection? Our readers would be fascinated. Before Amber could answer, Montgomery smoothly inserted himself between them. Miss Sullivan is still under contract with Bluegrass Stables. Any interviews should be arranged through our media relations department. I wasn't aware Miss Sullivan had been rehired, the reporter replied, with a pointed glance at Amber's visitor badge. A misunderstanding, Montgomery said with a tight smile. We've always valued her unique approach. Later, as security escorted Amber off the property, her temporary usefulness fulfilled, she caught sight of Montgomery watching her departure, his expression calculating rather than defeated. The reporter from Equestrian magazine observed the scene with professional fascination and commented to her photographer, "This isn't just a story about a girl and a horse. It's a phenomenon that defies everything we know about equine behavior. And look at Montgomery's expression. I think we just witnessed the beginning of a war. This isn't just a story about a girl and a horse. It's a phenomenon that defies everything we know about equine behavior. And look at Montgomery's expression. I think we just witnessed the beginning of a war." Richard Montgomery slammed the latest issue of Equestrian magazine against his mahogany desk, the sound echoing through his cavernous office. The cover photo, Amber embracing Phantom's neck, both bathed in golden sunlight, seemed to mock him from where it had fallen to the floor. 6 weeks had passed since the fire, and the magazine's 12-page feature had just hit newsstands with the headline, "The Miracle Whisperer: How an Unknown Cherokee Woman Achieved What Elite Trainers Couldn't." "This is unacceptable," Montgomery hissed, addressing the 3 men seated across from him, his head attorney, his chief public relations officer, and his private investigator. I want options, all of them. Whatever it takes to separate that girl from my horse." The PR man, Jensen, cleared his throat. "Sir, the narrative has evolved beyond our control. The story has resonated nationally. Attempting to publicly discredit Sullivan now might backfire." "I don't care about public perception," Montgomery snapped. "I care about a $4 million investment and not being made a fool of by some trailer park nobody." The private investigator, a former police detective named Rawlins, slid a thin folder across the desk. "We've been digging. Amber Sullivan, 22. Parents died in a car accident when she was 12. Cherokee father, Irish mother. Bounced through 7 foster homes before aging out of the system. No criminal record, but what?" Montgomery leaned forward. "There was an incident at her last placement. Sullivan, 17 at the time, filed abuse allegations against her foster father, a respected church deacon. Case was never fully investigated. She ran away before social services completed their assessment. Some statements from the family suggest she was troubled, attention-seeking." Montgomery's expression transformed, a cold smile replacing his scowl. "Perfect. Now we have something to work with." The next morning, Jim Wilkins summoned Amber to the administrative offices at Bluegrass Stables. Since the Equestrian magazine photo shoot, Montgomery had grudgingly allowed her limited access to Phantom, though always under supervision and ostensibly as a special consultant, rather than an employee. When she entered Wilkins' office, she was surprised to find Montgomery himself waiting, his demeanor unexpectedly cordial. "Miss Sullivan, please, have a seat," he said, gesturing to a chair across from him. Wilkins stood awkwardly by the window, clearly uncomfortable with whatever was about to unfold. Montgomery slid a checkbook from his jacket pocket. "I'll be direct. Your connection with Phantom has garnered significant attention. While impressive, it's creating complications for our breeding and training programs." He wrote deliberately, tore out the check, and placed it on the desk between them. $100,000. To help you start fresh somewhere else. Perhaps open that horse sanctuary you mentioned to Equestrian magazine." Amber stared at the check, momentarily stunned by the amount, more money than she'd ever seen, enough to change her life completely. For a heartbeat, she allowed herself to imagine what it could mean. A small place of her own, security she'd never known. Then she looked up, meeting Montgomery's calculating gaze, and understood. This wasn't generosity. It was erasure. He wasn't offering opportunity. He was buying her silence and absence. Slowly, deliberately, she picked up the check. Montgomery's smile widened fractionally. Then she tore it in half, and again, letting the pieces flutter back to the desk. "Phantom isn't for sale," she said quietly. "I'm not either." Montgomery's facade of civility evaporated. "You're making a serious mistake. That horse belongs to me. He's property, not a person, despite whatever mystical connection you think you have." "That's where we disagree," Amber replied, rising from her chair. "And I think you know it, or you wouldn't be trying to buy me off." As she turned to leave, Montgomery called after her. "Everyone has a price, Miss Sullivan. I just haven't found yours yet." 3 days later, the first tabloid story appeared. Horse whisperers troubled past. Sources revealed pattern of fabricated claims. The article, citing anonymous former caregivers, painted Amber as unstable and manipulative, suggesting her history of abuse allegations was attention-seeking behavior rather than genuine trauma. More stories followed, each more distorted than the last. A photo surfaced of teenage Amber at a protest against pipeline construction through native lands, reframed as evidence of anti-business radicalism. Her childhood interest in Cherokee spiritual practices was portrayed as bizarre occult behavior. "He's digging into your past," Jackson warned, showing her the latest tabloid during one of their now regular coffee meetings at the Rusty Horseshoe. "Anything he can twist and use against you." Amber stared at the headlines, a familiar hollowness expanding in her chest. She'd experienced this before, the systematic dismantling of her credibility, the way power protected itself by discrediting those who challenged it. "I was 14, she said quietly, fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug. "My third foster home. The father would come into my room at night. When I finally told someone, they moved me to a new home instead of investigating him. The same thing happened when I was 17, except that time I ran instead of reporting it. I slept in bus stations for 2 months before I found a shelter that would take me." Jackson covered her hand with his. "You don't have to explain yourself to me." "But that's what he's counting on, isn't it? That shame will silence me, that I'll be too embarrassed by the headlines to fight back." That evening, as Amber sat on the steps of her trailer watching the sunset, a sleek silver Lexus pulled up, a vehicle entirely out of place in whistle stop. The driver's door opened to reveal a distinguished older man with copper skin and silver-streaked black hair tied back in a traditional braid. "Amber Sullivan?" he asked, approaching with a gentle smile. "I'm Robert Blackfeather, professor of Indigenous Studies and Equine History at the University of Texas. May I have a moment of your time?" Inside her small trailer, Professor Blackfeather studied the photographs of Phantom that Amber had collected from news articles and social media. "Remarkable," he murmured, examining one particular image showing the stallion's distinctive chest markings. "You said he was sold to Montgomery as a pure thoroughbred with elite racing lineage?" Amber nodded. "That's what everyone at the stables believes. Why?" "Because I'm seeing characteristic markings consistent with Nakota heritage, specifically the Wakang bloodline." Noting her confusion, he explained, "The Nakota horses are descendants of the original Mustangs sacred to many Plains tribes. Most were systematically destroyed during the Indian Wars as part of cultural genocide. The few remaining pure bloodlines are protected under federal legislation as cultural heritage." "You think Phantom is part Nakota?" "I'd need genetic testing to confirm, but these chest markings," he pointed to a distinctive whorl pattern on Phantom's chest visible in several photos, "are highly specific to the Wakang lineage, considered spirit carriers among the Lakota. It would explain his exceptional intelligence and sensitivity." Professor Blackfeather's theory transformed the story overnight. His interview with Equestrian magazine, published online as a special feature, introduced a cultural and potentially legal dimension to Amber's connection with Phantom. If the stallion indeed carried protected Nakota bloodlines, Montgomery's treatment of him, particularly the harsh training methods former employees had described, could constitute violations of cultural heritage protection laws. Indigenous rights activists began contacting Amber. Conservation groups offered support. The narrative shifted from a simple girl and her horse story to questions about preservation of native bloodlines and ethical treatment of culturally significant animals. Montgomery's response came swiftly. At a mandatory staff meeting, he announced, "Phantom will be transferred to our specialized rehabilitation facility in Texas next week. The environment here has become counterproductive to his development." When word reached Amber through Maria's anxious text message, she drove immediately to Bluegrass Stables, demanding to see Montgomery. Security kept her at the gate until Wilkins came down to speak with her. "You can't just move him," Amber argued, her voice rising with desperation. "He's finally stable here. A change of environment will set back all his progress." "Mr. Montgomery's decision is final," Wilkins replied, looking genuinely regretful. "The transport is scheduled for Wednesday morning. At least let me see him before he goes. Let me prepare him somehow." Wilkins hesitated, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "Come at 5 tomorrow morning. I'll make sure security knows." That night, unable to sleep, Amber paced her small trailer, the walls seeming to close in with each turn. Everything she'd built with Phantom, the trust, the connection, the gradual healing of his traumatized spirit, was being torn away. And for what? A man's wounded pride? Her phone rang just after midnight. Jackson, his voice unusually urgent. "I've been talking to a friend in Texas," he said without preamble. "Someone who works near Montgomery's ranch. That specialized rehabilitation facility he mentioned? It's not what he's making it sound like." "What do you mean?" "It's more like a private zoo, a collection of exotic animals he keeps to impress visitors. endangered tigers, rare monkeys, even a pair of black rhinos, all just status symbols. But that doesn't make sense for Phantom, Amber said, confusion momentarily overtaking her worry. He's a horse, not an exotic animal. Unless Montgomery isn't planning rehabilitation at all, Jackson replied grimly. My contact says there's been unusual construction in one section of the property, some kind of demonstration arena, and Montgomery's been inviting specific guests for an event next month. The implication hung in the air between them, too terrible to voice aloud. Montgomery wasn't transferring Phantom for rehabilitation. He was setting the stage for something else entirely, something designed to destroy the narrative of connection that had captivated the public imagination. We need to stop him, Amber whispered, her voice breaking. We can't let him take Phantom. I'm working on it, Jackson promised. But Montgomery has powerful friends, including the local judge who'd need to issue any emergency injunction. We need more than suspicions. We need proof of his intentions. As Amber ended the call, she stared out her window at the stars, the same stars her father had taught her to name in both English and Cherokee. Somewhere in Texas, Montgomery was preparing a stage where he would attempt to prove that Phantom's wild nature could never truly be tamed, that the connection everyone had witnessed was merely a fluke, or worse, a fraud. While Amber observed, powerless, the preparations for Phantom's transfer, Jackson approached silently and slipped a paper into her hand. I have a friend in Texas, near Montgomery's ranch. He says that place isn't a sanctuary for horses like Montgomery claims. It's a collection of living trophies where animals are displayed as objects to impress billionaires. I have a friend in Texas near Montgomery's ranch. He says that place isn't a sanctuary for horses like Montgomery claims. It's a collection of living trophies where animals are displayed as objects to impress billionaires. Jackson's words hung in the air between them like a physical presence, solidifying Amber's worst fears. She stared at the crumpled paper in her hand, an address scrawled in Jackson's shaky handwriting along with a phone number. Her world narrowed to the sound of her own heartbeat, thundering in her ears as the full weight of Phantom's fate settled on her shoulders. There has to be something we can do, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant sounds of stable hands preparing for evening feed. Some legal way to stop this. Jackson's expression was grim. Montgomery moves in powerful circles. His type protects their own. The orange glow of sunset cast long shadows across the Kentucky bluegrass as Amber walked back to her trailer, each step heavier than the last. The paper with Jackson's contact information felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket. A lifeline too fragile to trust, yet the only one she had. That evening, the Rusty Horseshoe buzzed with unusual activity for a Wednesday night. When Amber pushed open the door, the conversations quieted momentarily before resuming with greater intensity. Mabel ushered her toward the back corner where a group had gathered around two tables pushed together, an unlikely coalition united by concern. There she is, Mabel announced, pulling out a chair. Sit down, child. You look like you haven't slept in days. Around the table sat faces that had become familiar over recent weeks. Jackson, his one hand clutching a mug of coffee, Maria and two other stable hands, Pete the night guard, several small-time local breeders who'd been vocal about Montgomery's methods, and most surprisingly, Catherine Williams, the elegantly dressed wife of Senator Williams, and a well-known animal rights advocate who had reached out after reading the Equestrian magazine feature. We've been discussing your situation, Catherine said, her Texas drawl softened by years in Washington. This move to Texas is clearly not in the horse's best interest. It's worse than that, Amber replied, sliding Jackson's note onto the table. Montgomery's planning some kind of demonstration to prove Phantom is still dangerous, that our connection isn't real. Maria crossed herself. That man's pride will destroy that beautiful animal. Jackson's contact in Texas had provided more details. Montgomery was constructing a special arena on his property. Rumors among the staff suggested he planned to prove Phantom's true nature by placing him in a situation designed to trigger his most aggressive instincts, possibly involving other animals. He wants to undo everything, Amber said, the realization crystallizing as she spoke. Show the world that Phantom is exactly what he claimed, uncontrollable, dangerous, beyond saving. It's not just about the horse anymore, Catherine observed. It's about you challenging his authority. Men like Montgomery don't tolerate that, especially from someone like me, Amber finished quietly. A nobody from a trailer park. We've contacted several equine rights organizations, Catherine continued. My husband's office is looking into the Nakota heritage angle. If we can prove Phantom has protected bloodlines, we might secure an emergency injunction to prevent the transfer, at least temporarily. Hope flickered briefly in Amber's chest. How quickly can we make that happen? That's the problem, said a thin man Amber recognized as Catherine's legal advisor. Genetic testing takes time. Montgomery has scheduled the transport for Monday, 5 days from now. Then we need to file for an emergency stay without the genetic evidence, Catherine insisted. Judge McAllister still owes Thomas a favor from the campaign. The group spent hours mapping strategy, the diner's regular customers watching with curious glances as napkins filled with notes and legal terms were passed around the table. By closing time, Catherine's team had drafted preliminary paperwork for an emergency hearing, while others had organized a social media campaign highlighting Phantom's possible indigenous heritage. The next morning, Amber arrived at the courthouse for the emergency hearing, wearing borrowed clothes, a modest blue dress lent by Catherine's assistant, the first formal outfit she'd worn since her high school graduation. Montgomery's legal team filled one side of the courtroom, 6 attorneys in tailored suits arranged like a wall of expensive fabric and privilege. Judge McAllister, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual frown, listened to arguments from both sides with practiced impassivity. Catherine's attorney presented evidence of Phantom's possible Nakota heritage and the bond Amber had established, arguing that removing the horse from his stable environment could cause irreparable psychological harm. Montgomery's lead counsel countered with clinical precision. Your Honor, this case rests entirely on speculation and sentimentality. Mr. Montgomery has documentation verifying Phantom's thoroughbred lineage. As for Ms. Sullivan's special bond with the animal, we submit that occasional compliance is not evidence of a unique connection. Mr. Montgomery, as the legal owner, has every right to transport his property to another of his facilities. When the judge finally spoke, his tone left little room for hope. While I appreciate the cultural significance of preserved bloodlines, the evidence presented is insufficient for an emergency injunction. Mr. Montgomery has provided proper documentation of ownership and transportation plans. Motion denied. In the courthouse hallway afterward, Amber found herself face-to-face with Montgomery for the first time since he'd offered her the check. His expression held the satisfied smirk of a man accustomed to winning. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "He's just a horse to you, one of dozens you own." Montgomery stepped closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "This stopped being about a horse the moment you decided to challenge me, Miss Sullivan. This is about people like you learning their place in the world." His words, cold and precise, confirmed what she'd suspected. Phantom had become collateral damage in a power struggle she never intended to start. The weekend passed in a blur of desperate planning and tearful goodbyes. Early Monday morning, Amber arrived at Bluegrass Stables under gray skies that matched her mood. Wilkins, looking uncomfortable but resolute, had arranged for her to have 30 minutes with Phantom before the transport trailer arrived. As she approached Stable 13 for what might be the last time, Amber was surprised to find not just Jackson waiting, but a small gathering of stable hands, including Maria and several others who had supported her quietly over the past weeks. "What's happening?" she asked, confused by their solemn expressions. Maria stepped forward, a small bundle of herbs and feathers in her hands. "We learned something for you. For both of you. An old Cherokee prayer of protection." Her accent wrapped around the unfamiliar words she'd clearly practiced. "For the journey ahead." Tears pricked at Amber's eyes as the group formed a circle around her. These people had nothing to gain, and potentially their jobs to lose by standing with her. Yet here they were, having learned words from a culture not their own to honor her heritage and her bond with Phantom. "Jackson taught us the words," explained Roberto, one of the younger stable hands. "We practiced 3 days to get it right." Inside stable 13, Phantom sensed the change immediately. The stallion paced restlessly, his dark eyes following Amber's every movement as if already aware of the separation to come. When she approached, he lowered his head to her shoulder, his breath warm against her neck. "I don't know if I can let you go," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his powerful neck. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." The stable hands entered quietly, forming a circle around horse and woman. Maria began the prayer, her voice tentative at first, then gaining strength as others joined in, the phonetically learned Cherokee words filling the space with an unexpected power. Phantom remained completely still throughout, his focus entirely on Amber, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. When the prayer ended, Jackson approached with red ochre paint he'd prepared. "Traditional blessing for a journey," he explained, dabbing a small mark on Phantom's forehead. "My grandmother was part Cherokee. She would have approved." The sound of trucks arriving shattered the peaceful moment. Outside, the transport trailer backed up to the stable entrance, accompanied by Montgomery's security team. Amber walked beside Phantom as handlers carefully led him toward the trailer, his ears flicking nervously at the unfamiliar sounds and smells. At the trailer's ramp, Phantom balked, sensing something wrong. He turned his head toward Amber, eyes wide with what could only be described as questioning fear. "It's okay," she lied, stroking his neck. "Everything will be okay." With gentle coaxing, the magnificent stallion finally entered the trailer, though his body remained tense, his movements reluctant. As the handlers secured the partition, Amber pressed her palm against the small window, Phantom immediately moving to press his muzzle against it from the other side. Montgomery appeared then, supervising the final preparations with cold efficiency. He didn't speak to Amber, but his satisfied expression said everything. He believed he'd won. As the trailer pulled away, Phantom's anxious whinny cut through the morning air like a physical pain. Amber watched until the vehicle disappeared down the long driveway, taking with it a piece of her heart she wasn't sure she could recover. "What now?" Jackson asked quietly, standing beside her as stable hands returned reluctantly to their duties. Before she could answer, Mabel's ancient pickup truck rattled into the parking area, coming to a stop with a wheeze of tired brakes. The older woman climbed out, waving an envelope. "Don't you give up yet, girl," she announced, pressing the envelope into Amber's hands. "We've been collecting at the diner. It's not much, $1,800, but it'll get you a bus ticket to Texas and keep you going for a little while." Amber opened the envelope with trembling fingers, staring at the collection of small bills, 5s, 10s, 20s, gathered from people who had little to spare themselves. "I can't accept this," she began, but Mabel cut her off with a stern look. "This isn't just about you and that horse anymore. It's about standing up to men who think money and power give them the right to crush whatever gets in their way." She glanced toward the empty road where the trailer had disappeared. "Sometimes the only thing worse than fighting a battle you might lose is not fighting at all." While the trailer disappeared in the distance, Catherine placed her hand on Amber's shoulder and said with determination, "Montgomery thinks he's won because he has money and power, but he doesn't understand what he's really facing. It's not just a girl fighting for a horse. It's an entire community defending something he will never comprehend. The right of living beings to choose their own freedom. Montgomery thinks he's won because he has money and power, but he doesn't understand what he's really facing. It's not just a girl fighting for a horse. It's an entire community defending something he will never comprehend. The right of living beings to choose their own freedom." Catherine's words lingered in Amber's mind as she boarded the Greyhound bus bound for Dallas. The worn vinyl seats smelled faintly of disinfectant and decades of travelers. Outside the window, Kentucky's rolling hills gradually gave way to flatter terrain as they crossed into Tennessee. $1,800, the collective generosity of people who barely knew her, crinkled in the envelope tucked inside her boot, alongside the crumpled paper with the address of Montgomery's Texas ranch. The bus hummed beneath her, a constant vibration that matched her restless thoughts. Phantom would have arrived in Texas by now. Was he terrified? Confused? Did he think she had abandoned him? The questions circled relentlessly as farmland blurred past the window. First time to Texas? Amber turned to find an elderly woman settling into the seat beside her, arranging a patchwork bag on her lap. Yes, Amber replied, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Business or pleasure, honey? Neither. I'm going to save someone. The woman nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable answer. Best reason to travel there is… As the journey stretched into its second day, Amber dozed fitfully between rest stops, her body cramped from the narrow seat. She woke with a jolt somewhere in Arkansas, the ghost of her father's voice fading from a dream. The Cherokee never give up when the heart points the way, he had told her once, teaching her to follow deer tracks through Kentucky woods. Our people survived because we understood that persistence is sometimes the only weapon we have. In her backpack, carefully wrapped in a flannel shirt, lay her father's old guitar. Too bulky to play on the crowded bus, its mere presence provided comfort, a connection to everything she'd left behind and everything she was fighting for. Meanwhile, in Louisville, Daniel Ramirez, an investigative reporter for the Courier-Journal, leaned back in his chair, studying the wall of notes he'd compiled on Richard Montgomery. What had begun as a simple follow-up on the viral horse whisperer had evolved into something far more substantial. This goes deeper than a feel-good animal story, he explained to his skeptical editor. I've interviewed 7 former employees who all describe the same pattern of abuse, not just with horses, but systemic labor violations, environmental corners cut. Montgomery has an army of lawyers, his editor warned. And I have sources willing to go on record, Ramirez countered, tapping a folder on his desk, including a former trainer who has video evidence of methods that violate every animal welfare standard in the industry. The editor sighed, recognizing the determined gleam in his reporter's eye. 3 weeks, he conceded. But I want this bulletproof before we publish. The Texas landscape spread before Amber like an alien planet after the lush green of Kentucky. Vast expanses of scrubland interrupted by oil pumps nodding like giant mechanical birds. The air felt different here, drier and somehow weightier with heat as she stepped off the bus in Amarillo for her final connection. She checked her phone, no service. The prepaid plan she could afford didn't extend to rural Texas. Isolation settled over her like a physical weight as she realized how truly alone she was, 1,000 miles from anyone who knew her name. The final leg of her journey delivered her to Westridge, a small town that existed primarily to service the nearby ranches and oil fields. The bus station was little more than a convenience store with a bench outside. Amber shouldered her backpack and guitar case, looking around at the dusty main street with growing uncertainty. The Montgomery place? The convenience store clerk repeated when she asked for directions. That's a good 20 miles north. No buses go that way. Is there a taxi service? The man laughed. Nearest taxi's in Amarillo. You could try calling Jeb's Rides, but he charges like he's driving a Rolls-Royce instead of a rusted F-150. After calculating the cost of Jeb's Rides against her dwindling funds, Amber made the only decision she could afford. She would walk as far as possible, then figure out the rest. 6 miles later, her skin burning under the relentless Texas sun, she paused to drink from her dwindling water supply. According to her map, Montgomery's ranch should be visible from the next ridge. As she crested the hill, the property finally came into view, a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by carefully maintained pastures, completely at odds with the arid landscape around it. A massive wrought iron gate marked the entrance, with a security booth and cameras monitoring the approach. Amber watched from a distance as a convoy of luxury vehicles passed through the gate. Men in expensive suits and women in designer dresses emerged, greeted by uniformed staff who directed them toward what appeared to be the main house, a modern architectural monstrosity of glass and stone. Her phone suddenly caught a signal, notifications flooding in. With trembling fingers, she opened a message from Maria. They're doing it today. Montgomery sent invitations to some special demonstration with Phantom this afternoon. Jackson's friend says it's happening at 3 o'clock. Amber checked the time. 2:15. 45 minutes to somehow get onto a heavily secured property and find Phantom before whatever Montgomery had planned began. The main entrance was clearly impossible. Security checked each vehicle thoroughly. Circling the perimeter, Amber followed the fence line, searching desperately for any weakness. After 20 minutes of walking, she spotted it. A section where flash flooding had eroded the ground beneath the fence, creating a gap barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. The metal edge caught her shirt as she wriggled underneath, tearing the fabric and scraping her back. Once inside, she found herself in what appeared to be an undeveloped section of the property, rough terrain not yet landscaped into Montgomery's manicured vision. Staying low, using scattered mesquite trees for cover, Amber made her way toward the cluster of buildings where activity seemed concentrated. The sound of voices grew louder, laughter, applause, the clink of glasses. Moving closer, she could see a gathering of perhaps 50 people around what appeared to be a circular arena. Her heart stopped when she saw what waited in the center. Phantom stood tethered to a post, his coat dulled by the journey and stress, head hanging lower than she'd ever seen. The proud stallion who had once demolished stable doors looked diminished somehow, as if the spirit that had defined him was being systematically extinguished. And beyond him, separated only by a mechanized gate, prowled 3 hyenas in a reinforced enclosure. The animals paced restlessly, occasionally focusing on the horse with predatory intensity. Montgomery stood on a raised platform, microphone in hand, addressing his assembled guests who sipped champagne from crystal flutes. His voice carried clearly in the still air. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've all heard the stories about this horse and his supposed connection with a certain young woman. The media loves such heartwarming narratives." His tone dripped with condescension. "Today, we'll see the truth about what this animal really is. A wild, dangerous creature that no amount of sentimental handling can truly tame." Amber watched in horror as Montgomery held up a silver whistle. "When this sounds, the gate will open partially. Not enough for the hyenas to fully enter, but enough to demonstrate my point. Without his special friend here, you'll see exactly how this horse responds to threat, with uncontrollable aggression, the natural state that no amount of mystical Cherokee singing can override." Understanding crashed over Amber with sickening clarity. Montgomery wasn't just trying to disprove her connection with Phantom. He was deliberately creating a situation where the horse would either attack or be attacked, reinforcing the narrative that he was dangerous and uncontrollable. "Either way, I win," Montgomery continued, unaware of her presence. "Either he attacks the hyenas, proving his dangerous nature, or his fear paralyzes him and the hyenas intimidate him, proving he's not the magnificent specimen the media portrayed. Either outcome demonstrates why he should never have been the focus of such misguided attention." Amber's mind raced. Security personnel were positioned throughout the gathering. There was no way to simply walk in without being immediately detained. But if she waited, Montgomery would execute his cruel demonstration, potentially pushing Phantom back into the traumatized state from which she'd so carefully helped him emerge. The familiar paralysis of powerlessness threatened to overwhelm her. The same feeling she'd experienced in foster homes where she had no voice, no rights, no recourse against those with authority over her. But this time, the stakes weren't just her own well-being. Phantom's entire future, perhaps his life, hung in the balance. In that moment, she remembered what Catherine had said. This wasn't just about one girl fighting for one horse. It was about challenging a system that treated living beings as disposable commodities. If she failed now, she failed not just Phantom, but everything he had come to represent. Montgomery raised the whistle to his lips, the afternoon sun glinting off its silver surface. Amber knew with absolute certainty that she had only seconds to act. Drawing a deep breath, she stepped out from behind the storage shed where she'd been hiding and walked directly into the gathering. Disheveled from days of travel, clothes dusty and torn, she moved with quiet determination through the crowd of elegantly dressed guests. The contrast was so stark that at first, no one moved to stop her, the unexpectedness of her appearance creating a moment of collective hesitation. All eyes turned to her, conversations halting mid-sentence. Montgomery froze, the whistle halfway to his mouth, his expression shifting from confidence to shock as he recognized the figure moving steadily toward the center of his carefully orchestrated spectacle. "Security," he finally managed, but his call came a crucial moment too late. Phantom had already seen her. The stallion's head shot up, ears pricked forward in sudden alertness, his entire body language transforming in an instant. The dull resignation vanished, replaced by focused attention as his nostrils flared to catch her scent across the arena. For one terrible moment, everything hung in perfect balance. Montgomery with whistle poised, Hyenas sensing the change in atmosphere, security personnel moving toward Amber, and Phantom standing utterly still, every fiber of his being oriented toward the one person who had ever truly seen him. While hidden among thorny bushes, dehydrated and exhausted, Amber finally glimpsed the macabre scene Montgomery had prepared. Phantom, the magnificent black stallion, tied to a central post, surrounded by an elegant crowd drinking champagne, and just a few yards away, an enclosure with 3 agitated hyenas, separated only by a gate that Montgomery, microphone in hand, was preparing to open remotely. While hidden among thorny bushes, dehydrated and exhausted, Amber finally glimpsed the macabre scene Montgomery had prepared. Phantom, the magnificent black stallion, tied to a central post, surrounded by an elegant crowd drinking champagne, and just a few yards away, an enclosure with 3 agitated hyenas, separated only by a gate that Montgomery, microphone in hand, was preparing to open remotely. The silver whistle hovered at Montgomery's lips, catching the harsh Texas sunlight. Time seemed to crystallize into a single perfect moment of horror as Amber realized the full extent of his plan. This wasn't merely a demonstration. It was an execution disguised as entertainment, a spectacle designed to erase everything she and Phantom had built together. Without conscious thought, Amber burst from her hiding place. Her legs carried her forward before her mind could process the consequences, weaving between startled guests in designer clothing who parted before her like water around a stone. Their gasps and exclamations faded to white noise as she focused solely on the black stallion at the center of it all. "Stop this immediately!" A woman's voice cut through the stunned silence. Amber recognized Catherine Williams rising from her seat, face flushed with indignation. "This is flagrant animal cruelty." Montgomery's composure faltered for only a second before his businessman's smile reasserted itself. "Mrs. Williams, I assure you this is merely a controlled demonstration of natural behaviors. Security," he barked, "remove this trespasser from my property." 2 men in black uniforms moved toward Amber, but they stopped abruptly when Phantom suddenly reared, pulling against his restraints with such force that the post creaked ominously. The sound of splitting wood echoed across the arena as the stallion's front hooves pawed the air in a display of raw power that sent the nearest guests scrambling backward. "My God," someone whispered as Phantom broke free, the frayed rope dangling from his neck. Every instinct in the room screamed danger. A 1,000-pound animal previously declared dangerous, now unrestrained among civilians. Security personnel reached for their weapons. Montgomery's face drained of color as his carefully orchestrated scenario spiraled beyond his control. But instead of charging the crowd or fleeing, Phantom did something that defied every expectation. He positioned himself directly between Amber and the hyenas, his powerful body a living shield protecting her from potential threat. His stance wasn't aggressive, it was protective, deliberate, almost human in its clear intent. The crowd fell into a stunned silence broken only by the frustrated snarls of the hyenas, who sensed the disruption in the planned events. Amber stood perfectly still, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Phantom's ears flicked back toward her, acknowledging her presence while keeping his attention focused on the predators behind the gate. "This is property trespass," Montgomery recovered enough to declare, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Security, I want her removed immediately." Before the men could approach again, Phantom did something extraordinary. Rising once more onto his hind legs, the stallion emitted a series of vocalizations unlike anything the onlookers had ever heard. Not the familiar neigh of a domestic horse, but a complex, almost musical pattern of sounds that seemed to resonate across the arena. "Remarkable," breathed an elderly man with copper skin and silver-streaked hair tied in a braid. Professor Blackfeather had risen from his seat, eyes wide with recognition. "That's a wild herd warning call, a specific pattern used only by lead stallions to protect their group. I've only heard recordings of this. It's practically extinct behavior." The hyenas, clearly confused by the unfamiliar sound, backed away from the gate, their aggressive posture diminishing despite their predatory nature. The crowd murmured in astonishment as they witnessed what appeared to be interspecies communication. Montgomery attempted to regain control of the situation. "It's merely coincidence. The horse is frightened, not protecting anyone." His protests fell flat as Amber, moving with fluid grace born from absolute trust, stepped forward and placed her hand on Phantom's shoulder. The stallion immediately lowered himself from his rearing position, though his body remained vigilant, muscles tensed beneath his ebony coat. In a motion so smooth it seemed they had rehearsed it 1,000 times, Amber swung herself onto Phantom's back. With no saddle, no bridle, not even a lead rope to guide him, she sat tall above the astonished crowd, her hand resting lightly on the stallion's neck. "That's not coincidence, Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice carrying unexpectedly clear across the hushed arena. "It's connection, something money can't buy." Phones emerged from pockets and purses, capturing the extraordinary tableau. Several guests who had come expecting an amusing diversion now found themselves witnessing something that challenged everything they'd been told about animal behavior and human dominance. Guided by the subtlest shifts in Amber's posture, Phantom began a deliberate circuit around the hyena's enclosure. The predators tracked his movement but continued to keep their distance, responding to the authority in his stance and vocalizations. It was a demonstration more powerful than anything Montgomery could have planned. A perfect harmony between human and horse, achieved not through force, but through mutual respect. "This isn't just a thoroughbred," Professor Blackfeather announced, approaching the center of the arena. His academic authority commanded attention even from those who had been laughing at Montgomery's jokes moments earlier. "I need to examine those markings more closely." With Amber's gentle encouragement, Phantom allowed the professor to approach and study the distinctive whorl patterns on his chest. The elderly man's fingers traced the markings with reverent care. "These chest patterns, they're typical of the Wakang lineage of the Nakota horses," he declared, his voice gaining strength with conviction. "These specific markings here," he pointed to a distinctive whorl pattern, "are characteristic of horses considered spirit carriers among the Lakota people." The revelation rippled through the crowd. Several guests with backgrounds in conservation and cultural heritage immediately recognized the implications. Nakota horses were protected under federal legislation, their bloodlines considered living cultural artifacts of America's indigenous peoples. Montgomery's face darkened as he realized the shift in the room. His demonstration was not only failing to discredit Amber, it was potentially exposing him to legal scrutiny. "This is my horse," he shouted, his composure finally cracking. "I paid $4 million for him, and I'll do what I want with my property." "Not today," Catherine Williams responded, already on her phone. "I've just spoken with the Attorney General's office. Experts are on their way to verify Phantom's lineage. Until then, he remains under temporary protection." As if understanding the turning tide, Phantom relaxed beneath Amber, his posture shifting from defensive alert to quiet dignity. The transformation was so complete that several guests murmured in disbelief. This was the same animal that had been described as uncontrollably violent. "You orchestrated this," Montgomery hissed at Amber, quiet enough that only those nearest could hear. "Somehow you planned this humiliation." "No," she replied simply. "I just listened when no one else would." The demonstration that Montgomery had meticulously planned as Phantom's downfall had instead become a powerful affirmation of everything Amber had claimed. That beneath the fear and trauma lay an intelligent, sensitive being capable of profound connection. As security personnel stood uncertain, awaiting clear direction that Montgomery seemed unable to provide, Amber guided Phantom in another circuit of the arena. This time, the stallion moved with the natural grace of a show horse, his steps measured and proud. head carried high. The contrast with the tethered, despondent animal from just minutes earlier could not have been more stark. "My people have a saying," Professor Blackfeather said, addressing the crowd that now hung on his every word. "When you break a horse's spirit, you break something in your own. But when you honor a horse's nature, you find something in yourself you never knew was missing." Several of Montgomery's guests, people of influence and wealth who had come expecting entertainment at a living creature's expense, now looked uncomfortable with their complicity. A few had put away their champagne glasses, their expressions thoughtful as they witnessed something that challenged the very foundations of how they viewed the natural world. The gate to the hyenas' enclosure remained partially open, but the animals had retreated to the far corner, still watching but no longer displaying aggression. Their behavior itself was a testament to something primal and true. Genuine authority needed no cruelty to assert itself. In a final, breathtaking display of trust, Amber leaned forward and wrapped her arms around Phantom's neck in an embrace that spoke of something beyond training or control. The stallion lowered his head slightly, eyes half closed in an expression of complete surrender to the moment. Cameras captured the image that would soon spread across social media and news outlets worldwide. The trailer park girl and the $4 million racehorse, two beings from entirely different worlds, united in a connection that transcended conventional understanding. As Catherine Williams coordinated with authorities by phone and Professor Blackfeather took samples of Phantom's hair for DNA testing, Montgomery retreated to the periphery of his own event, his face a mask of controlled fury as he watched his narrative of dominance crumble before his eyes. "This isn't over," he murmured to his attorney. "Find a way to contain this." But it was already too late. The story had evolved beyond his ability to control it. What had begun as one woman's fight for one horse had transformed into a powerful symbol of resistance against a system that valued profit over compassion, control over connection. While cameras captured each moment of the extraordinary demonstration, the Professor Blackfeather approached to examine marks on Phantom's coat and announced with academic authority, "This isn't just an ordinary thoroughbred. I see unmistakable characteristics of the rare Nakota horses, direct descendants of the sacred Mustangs to many indigenous peoples. These specific markings on the chest are from the Wakang lineage, considered spirit carriers among the Lakota. And if I'm correct, this animal is legally protected under federal legislation as American cultural heritage. This isn't just an ordinary thoroughbred. I see unmistakable characteristics of the rare Nakota horses, direct descendants of the sacred Mustangs to many indigenous peoples. These specific markings on the chest are from the Wakang lineage, considered spirit carriers among the Lakota. And if I'm correct, this animal is legally protected under federal legislation as American cultural heritage." Professor Blackfeather's declaration fell across Montgomery's carefully orchestrated gathering like a thunderclap. The wealthy guests, who moments earlier had been sipping champagne in anticipation of an amusing spectacle, now exchanged uncomfortable glances. Several pulled out phones, no longer to document Montgomery's triumph, but to search for information about Nakota horses and protection statutes. Catherine Williams moved with practiced efficiency, the political spouse's ability to navigate crisis evident in her composed demeanor. "I'm calling in a team from the Cultural Heritage Protection Division," she announced, her Texas drawl carrying authority that silenced even Montgomery's attempt to interrupt. "Until Phantom's lineage is officially verified, this animal cannot be subjected to potentially harmful demonstrations." Montgomery's face flushed with an anger he could barely contain. The veins at his temples pulsed visibly as he watched his carefully constructed narrative collapse. "This is preposterous," he spat, striding toward Amber, who remained seated atop Phantom's back. "A last-minute fabrication to interfere with private property rights. This horse has documented thoroughbred lineage going back 5 generations. Documentation can be falsified," Professor Blackfeather replied mildly, continuing to examine the distinctive whorl patterns on Phantom's chest. "These markings, however, cannot. Their genetic signatures as unique and identifiable as fingerprints to those who know what to look for." Amber remained quiet throughout this exchange, her hand resting lightly on Phantom's neck. She could feel the tension in his muscles gradually easing, his breathing slowing from the agitated rhythm it had maintained since she first spotted him tied to the post. Beneath her, his body communicated everything words couldn't: relief, recognition, and a tentative return of the trust they had built in those early morning sessions at Bluegrass Stables. 24 hours, Catherine announced, ending a call on her phone. A specialized team will arrive tomorrow morning to collect DNA samples and conduct a preliminary assessment. Until then, Phantom remains here, but under neutral supervision. On my property, Montgomery's voice rose dangerously. You have no authority. Actually, Mr. Montgomery, Catherine interrupted smoothly, when potential violations of the Native American Cultural Heritage Protection Act are identified, federal agencies have considerable authority. Would you prefer they arrive with a formal cease and desist order? I'm sure the press would find that interesting. The mention of press coverage was calculated, and its effect immediate. Montgomery's jaw clenched as he visibly calculated his options. Around them, guests were already discreetly departing, sensing that the entertainment portion of the afternoon had given way to something far more complicated and potentially scandalous. Fine, he finally conceded, his tone brittle. 24 hours, but my legal team will be present for every moment, and I expect full compensation for this disruption to my property rights. As night fell over the sprawling Texas ranch, Amber sat cross-legged in Phantom's temporary enclosure, her back against the fence post. The stallion dozed, standing nearby, one hind leg cocked, his ears occasionally flicking toward sounds in the darkness. Two neutral observers, a local veterinarian and an animal welfare officer, maintained a respectful distance, monitoring the situation as agreed in the hastily negotiated temporary arrangement. I never thought I'd see you again, Amber whispered, more to herself than to Phantom. I didn't know if I'd make it in time. The stallion's ear twitched in her direction, acknowledging her voice even in his half-sleep. This simple recognition, that he continued to track her presence even while resting, spoke volumes about how far they had come from those first tense encounters in Stable 13. Dawn broke in a blaze of orange and gold across the Texas horizon, painting the landscape in colors that reminded Amber of Phantom's distinctive chest markings. She had dozed intermittently through the night, unwilling to leave his side even when Catherine had offered her a guest room in the hotel where many of Montgomery's visitors had stayed. By mid-morning, the ranch had transformed from a private showplace to something resembling a scientific expedition base. A team of geneticists, cultural heritage experts, and federal officials had arrived, setting up portable equipment to process samples on site. Professor Blackfeather moved among them, his academic credentials earning him respect even from the skeptical scientists. Montgomery watched from the porch of his modernist mansion, his expression unreadable as technicians in white coats collected hair samples, photographed markings, and measured various aspects of Phantom's conformation. His team of attorneys hovered nearby, occasionally conferring in hushed tones. This will take time, explained Dr. Eliza Morales, the lead geneticist, as she carefully labeled a vial containing Phantom's hair. Comprehensive DNA analysis requires laboratory conditions, but we can run preliminary marker tests here that might give us some indication. While the scientific team worked, a more unexpected development unfolded. Word of Phantom's situation had spread through social media overnight, Catherine's connections ensuring that what might have remained a private dispute became a public interest story. By noon, a small group of protesters had gathered at the main gate of Montgomery's ranch, their signs visible from the main house: "Protect Native Heritage" and "Horses are not toys for billionaires." More concerning for Montgomery, a news van from a Dallas television station had parked nearby, a reporter doing live stand-ups with the ranch entrance as backdrop. Sources tell us that genetic testing is currently underway to determine if this valuable racehorse actually carries protected Native American bloodlines, the reporter explained to viewers across Texas. If confirmed, it raises serious questions about how the animal was obtained and treated. Inside the makeshift testing area, Amber sat quietly with Phantom, maintaining the connection that had become their shared language. Unlike the agitated, traumatized animal she had first encountered at Bluegrass Stables, Phantom now stood calmly amid the unfamiliar activity, his trust in her presence evident in his relaxed posture. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Morales commented to Professor Blackfeather as they observed the pair. "Most horses would be showing significant stress markers in this environment, especially one with his history of trauma. That's because most modern horse training is based on dominance rather than partnership," the professor replied. "What Ms. Sullivan has achieved here is closer to how indigenous peoples worked with horses for centuries, through relationship rather than subjugation." By late afternoon, the preliminary results were ready. Dr. Morales gathered the key participants, Montgomery and his attorneys, Catherine Williams, Professor Blackfeather, and Amber, in the ranch's conference room. Phantom remained in his enclosure, visible through the large windows, now comfortable enough to graze on the fresh hay provided. "Based on our initial genetic markers, we can confirm with approximately 87% confidence that this horse carries significant Nakota heritage," Dr. Morales announced, her scientific detachment giving the statement additional weight. "Specifically, we're seeing genetic markers consistent with the Wakang bloodline, as Professor Blackfeather suggested." Montgomery's lead attorney immediately challenged the findings. "Preliminary results are inadmissible in any legal proceeding. We demand comprehensive testing conducted by an independent laboratory." "Of course," Dr. Morales agreed. "This is merely our initial assessment. Complete genomic sequencing will follow." "And what does this mean exactly?" Montgomery asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Even if this horse has some distant mixed heritage, it doesn't negate my ownership rights." Catherine's expression remained calm, but her eyes hardened. "It means, Mr. Montgomery, that if these findings are confirmed, Phantom falls under the protection of the Native American Cultural Heritage Preservation Act. His lineage would qualify him as living cultural heritage, subject to specific care requirements and restrictions on use, particularly the kind of exploitation you had planned." The next 48 hours unfolded like a whirlwind. Complete DNA testing confirmed what the preliminary results had suggested. Phantom carried 37% Nakota genetic markers, specifically from the rare Wakang lineage that had been thought nearly extinct in purebred form. The revelation transformed what had begun as a personal conflict into a national news story, touching on issues of cultural preservation, animal welfare, and the ethics of private ownership of historically significant bloodlines. As media interest intensified, more troubling stories about Montgomery's business practices began to surface. A former employee revealed documentation showing that Montgomery had knowingly purchased Phantom with falsified lineage papers, specifically because genetic testing had revealed the Nakota markers that made the horse uniquely suited to endurance and recovery, valuable traits for racing, but inconvenient for registration in thoroughbred competitions. Environmental activists who had long monitored Montgomery's oil operations in sensitive ecosystems found a suddenly receptive audience for their concerns. Financial journalists began investigating rumors of irregularities in his company's reporting. The empire that had seemed unassailable began showing cracks under the unprecedented scrutiny. Montgomery, recognizing the shifting landscape, attempted damage control. His PR team released statements emphasizing his commitment to heritage preservation and announcing a generous donation to indigenous education programs. But the narrative had slipped beyond his ability to reshape it, particularly when former employees continued coming forward with stories of systematic mistreatment of both animals and workers. 5 days after the failed demonstration, Amber sat with Catherine Williams and Professor Blackfeather in a small conference room at the federal building in Dallas. Across the table, federal attorneys explained the unfolding situation. "Given the confirmed heritage and the documented evidence of mistreatment, we've secured an emergency preservation order," explained the lead attorney, a serious woman with silver-streaked hair. "Phantom cannot be returned to Mr. Montgomery's custody while the investigation continues." "Where will he go?" Amber asked, the question that had worried her most since this began. "That's where we'd like your help," the attorney replied. "The preservation order allows for temporary placement with a qualified caretaker who understands the cultural significance and specialized needs of the bloodline. Professor Blackfeather has recommended you for that role." Amber's breath caught in her throat. "Me? but I don't have facilities, resources. We've received several offers of support, Catherine interjected gently. People who believe in what you've done, who want to help create something more permanent. The conversation continued, laying out possibilities that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. A foundation dedicated to rehabilitating traumatized horses, preserving native bloodlines, and educating the public about indigenous horse culture. Through it all, Amber felt as though she were watching from outside herself, unable to fully comprehend how her simple connection with one traumatized horse had catalyzed such far-reaching change. When Montgomery finally faced Amber again, it was in the sterile environment of a legal deposition. His empire showing multiple cracks under investigation, his reputation tarnished by daily revelations, he still maintained the rigid posture of a man unaccustomed to defeat. "You have no idea what you've unleashed, girl," he said during a break, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "This isn't over." Amber met his gaze steadily, no longer intimidated by his wealth or power. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Montgomery," she replied quietly. "It isn't over, it's just beginning." 6 months later, on a misty morning in the Kentucky hills, Amber Sullivan watched the sunrise from a modest farmhouse overlooking rolling pastures. The Phantom's Promise Foundation now occupied a former tobacco farm converted into a sanctuary for traumatized horses. Funded by public donations and supported by Nashville celebrities moved by the story, the foundation had become a rehabilitation center where rescued horses recovered under gentle care. 6 months later, on a misty Kentucky morning, Amber Sullivan watched the first rays of sunlight filter through the fog that blanketed the rolling hills. She sat on the weathered porch steps of a modest farmhouse, cradling a steaming mug of coffee between her palms. The former tobacco farm, with its faded red barn and sprawling pastures, had transformed over the past months into something new. A sanctuary not just for horses, but for broken spirits of all kinds. The Phantom's Promise Foundation had begun with a viral story and Catherine Williams's connections, but it had grown through something more powerful. Hundreds of small donations, volunteers showing up with hammers and paintbrushes, locals bringing home-cooked meals for work crews. What Montgomery had dismissed as impossible, a trailer park girl creating something meaningful, had materialized through the collective will of people who believed some things were worth fighting for. Amber's gaze drifted to the largest pasture where a black silhouette moved through the morning mist. Phantom, his coat gleaming with health that had been absent during his racing days, trotted with the fluid grace that had once made him worth millions. But what made Amber's heart swell wasn't his perfect conformation or powerful stride. It was how he now moved with 7 other rescued horses, guiding them with gentle nudges and communicative whinnies. "Morning," called a familiar voice as Jackson emerged from the barn, moving carefully with his one arm carrying a bucket of feed supplements. The elderly veterinarian had relocated to Kentucky once the foundation secured funding, bringing decades of experience and a lifetime of compassion to their work. "He's gathering them again," Amber observed, nodding toward Phantom. Jackson settled beside her on the steps, his weathered face crinkling with a smile. "Never seen anything like it in 50 years of practice. He's teaching them to be horses again." In the pasture, Phantom circled a nervous Appaloosa mare, their newest rescue, still flinching at shadows after years of abuse. The black stallion didn't crowd her or force interaction. Instead, he simply existed in her space, occasionally dropping his head to graze nearby, demonstrating through his calm presence that there was nothing to fear. "It's like watching a master therapist," Jackson mused. "He knows exactly what each one needs, when to push, when to back off." The foundation's approach had raised eyebrows in traditional equestrian circles. No round pens forcing compliance, no breaking spirits to achieve submission. Instead, they created space for healing, allowing traumatized horses to rediscover their own nature at their own pace. Critics called it sentimental and impractical. Results were proving them wrong. The sound of tires on gravel announced the day's first arrival. A white van with Lakewood Youth Center painted on its side pulled up, followed by 2 passenger cars. 8 teenagers climbed out, their body language a study in defensive posturing, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast or defiantly challenging. Each carried burdens invisible to casual observation: foster care histories, juvenile records, addiction recovery journeys. Maria, who had left Bluegrass Stables to become the Foundation's program coordinator, greeted them with the perfect balance of warmth and respect. "Welcome. Who remembers the first rule from orientation?" A girl with purple-streaked hair and a septum piercing reluctantly raised her hand. "No sudden movements, no loud noises. Horses sense everything." "Exactly," Maria affirmed. "These horses have stories not so different from some of yours. They're learning to trust again, just like many of you." Amber watched as Maria led the group toward the small arena where today's session would begin. The Foundation's most transformative program connected troubled youth with traumatized horses, two populations the world had largely written off, finding healing in each other's company. By mid-morning, the property hummed with activity. Two equine behaviorists conducted research on trauma recovery methods. A film crew documented the Foundation's work for an educational series. Volunteers tended to the endless tasks of maintaining a working farm. Through it all, Amber moved with quiet purpose, no longer the uncertain girl who had once feared speaking up in foster homes. "Miss Sullivan?" A young boy from the youth program approached hesitantly. "Is it true that Phantom killed somebody before you met him?" Amber considered her response carefully. Phantom was badly hurt by people who didn't understand him. When we're hurt badly enough, sometimes we lash out to protect ourselves. It doesn't make us bad, just wounded. The boy nodded slowly, his eyes tracking to a faded scar on his own arm. "So he got better because you fixed him?" "No," Amber replied gently. "He got better because I gave him space to fix himself. There's a big difference." Around noon, Professor Blackfeather arrived for his monthly consultation, his silver-streaked braid now a familiar sight at the Foundation. The University of Texas had granted him partial leave to document the Wakang bloodline characteristics emerging in Phantom and develop educational materials about indigenous horse practices. "The genetic preservation program is proceeding excellently," he reported as he and Amber walked the perimeter of the property. 3 mares with confirmed Nakota markers have been identified for potential breeding next season. "And the cultural education component?" Amber asked. 5 tribal youth programs have requested workshops. Your methods, or rather your non-methods, resonate deeply with traditional knowledge that was nearly lost. The professor smiled. "What you discovered instinctively, our ancestors understood for centuries before European horsemanship imposed dominance as the only path to partnership." They paused at the fence line, watching Phantom guide his small herd toward the pond. The once feared killer horse now moved with the measured confidence of a natural leader. His interactions with other horses revealing an emotional intelligence that conventional training would have suppressed rather than nurtured. The Lakota called them Sunkawakan, mystery dogs, because they carried medicine that could heal human spirits, Professor Blackfeather said quietly. "What's happening here isn't new, Amber. It's very, very old." Late afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the main gate, causing a momentary ripple of tension among staff who remembered similar vehicles from Montgomery's security team. But when the driver's door opened, it revealed Richard Montgomery himself, without entourage or attorneys. "Mr. Montgomery," Amber acknowledged, meeting him at the gate. 6 months had visibly aged the once imposing figure. Legal battles and investigations had diminished his empire, though he had managed to retain significant assets through settlements and strategic concessions. "Miss Sullivan," he returned stiffly, "I've come to see what you've built with my horse." "He's not your horse anymore," she reminded him gently. "But you're welcome to see what he's become." The tour was conducted in uncomfortable silence. Montgomery observed the rehabilitation facilities, the youth program in progress, the research being conducted. His expression remained unreadable as he watched Phantom leading other horses with natural authority that no human training could have instilled. "Why did you really come here?" Amber finally asked as they reached the original barn, now converted into an education center. Montgomery's carefully maintained facade cracked slightly. to understand what I missed, what I failed to see. And what do you see now? His gaze drifted to where a teenage girl with scars on her wrists was gently grooming a trembling quarter horse. That perhaps there are different kinds of value than what I've spent my life pursuing. As sunset approached, Montgomery prepared to leave. The visit had not been reconciliation. Too much had happened for that. But perhaps something equally important, recognition. At the gate, he paused. "My father broke horses the way his father broke him," he said quietly. "Some cycles are harder to break than others." With those words, he departed, leaving Amber with the uncomfortable awareness that even villains carried their own wounds, their own broken pieces seeking wholeness. Evening settled over the foundation, painting the Kentucky hills in shades of amber and gold. The day's visitors departed, volunteers headed home, and a peaceful quiet descended on the property. Amber made her final rounds, checking on new arrivals and ensuring all was secure for the night. In the main pasture, Phantom waited by the gate, his ritual of seeking her company at day's end unchanged, despite his new role as herd leader. When Amber slipped through the fence, he approached with gentle greeting, his muzzle softly nudging her shoulder. "Ready for our ride?" she asked, though no words were truly necessary between them anymore. Without saddle or bridle, Amber mounted with a single fluid motion born of complete trust. Together they moved across the darkening landscape, two silhouettes merging into one against the twilight sky. No commands were given, no control asserted. Their communication existed in the realm of breath, weight shifts, and a connection that defied conventional understanding. They crested the highest hill on the property just as the first stars appeared. Below them spread the foundation, its lights twinkling in the gathering darkness, a beacon of hope carved from what had once seemed impossible odds. Phantom stood perfectly still, his breathing synchronized with Amber's as they shared this moment of quiet triumph. From adversaries forced together by circumstance, they had become partners in creating something that reached far beyond themselves, a place where broken beings, both human and equine, could rediscover their inherent worthiness. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely voice echoing across the hills. Phantom's ears pricked forward, listening to a wildness that still lived within him, not extinguished but channeled into wisdom rather than fear. His journey from killer horse to healer reflected something profound about trauma's path, not a return to some imagined innocence, but a transformation into something new that honored rather than denied the scars. "I don't know if you're a medicine horse," Amber whispered, leaning forward to embrace his strong neck. "I just know you healed me as much as I healed you." At the evening's end, when visitors had departed and the foundation grew quiet, Amber walked to the field where Phantom grazed peacefully. Without words needed between them, she mounted his back, and together they galloped through the fields of Kentucky, two free spirits who had found in each other the home they had both always sought.